What is up, everyone? So today I'm sure you're talking about, or you want to know about, how do you do Devsecops at scale? So today I have Abhay Bhargav from V45 as a guest, and we spoke about how do you do app security and Devsecops at scale. Even if you don't have anyone who is an AppSec person in your company, or even if you are an expert, where could you be maturing into? We also spoke about serverless security as well. So if that's something that, and how does security change in serverless security? So, all right. If you like the episode, you can hear the whole episode on www.cloudsecuritypodcast.tv, or just simply like and comment if you have any questions. Also subscribe and hit the bell icon as well if you want to get notification when we release a new episode. All right, let's get in the episode. Welcome to Cloud Security Podcast. Today, my guest is Abhay. He is the founder of WE45. For people who may not have heard of WE45, I've come across them quite a bit at a lot of training in Black Hat, at OAuth AppSec Day. But I'm not going to spoil his introduction, and I'm going to let Abhay introduce himself. Welcome, Abhay. Nice to have you here.
Hi. Hi, Ashish. Nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So for people who don't know Abhay and WE45, well, how would you introduce yourself and the organization?
So yeah, I mean, We45 is a focused application security company. So we do a lot of application security. We started off as purely an offensive application security house, but today we've kind of morphed that into multiple things. So one is, of course, we are one of the forerunners in Devsecops. We created the world's first Devsecops program. It's very popular. Like you said, we run it at Black Hat, several other conferences, and private trainings as well. We also do a lot of cloud security, containers, Kubernetes, anything that is slightly more cutting edge application security. You'll see us do a lot of work, a lot of research, put out a lot of tools there. So that's on the services side of the fence. We also have a very active training practice. In fact, all of this month through May through June, we're running a full remote training. We're running a roster of remote training sessions on cloud security, AppSec, containers, and so on. So you should check it out on our website. The other thing that we also do is a product. So we have a very, very interesting vulnerability correlation product called Orchestron, which helps you kind of handle and deduplicate vulnerabilities that come from different sources. So if you're doing DevSecOps of some sort, you'll probably have tool results coming in from different places like checkmarks or burp or what have you, multiple tools, right? So this kind of centralizes, correlates, aggregates all the tools and gives you a singular, unified and aggregated perspective of all those vulnerabilities. So that's
Right. That's an interesting. Maybe we should talk about a bit more as we go into this.
Sure.
One of the first questions that I have been asking a lot of my guests and my regular audience is already aware of. What does cloud security mean for you?
So cloud security is essentially, for me, it is something that an organization should try and achieve through a lot of one, of course, in terms of understanding where your responsibility starts and stops. That itself is something a lot of organizations and people don't get about the cloud. The second thing is try and achieve that at scale. That is, try and automate some of this, because obviously on the cloud, it is naturally oriented towards automation. So if you're not leveraging that, you're missing out. And third, it gives you, I think, a ton of services to be able to do security really well. So you should try and leverage all of those services that they give you to do your security really well on the cloud. So I think cloud security provides a great opportunity to be more secure, but it takes a little bit of time to get people to see that.
Right. Now that's a great answer, and I think we definitely need to get into a bit of challenges as well. But one of the challenges that I'm going to quickly segue into is that a lot of people talk about multi-cloud and they have to deal with Azure and Google Cloud and other things as well. Do you see multi-cloud as a thing coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely a case for, or there is definitely the presence of multi-cloud. I've seen this with large customers, especially. So we deal with some very large customers, either in publishing or in banking, insurance. They have essentially this presence of shadow IT. Right now, cloud is also becoming, an aspect of shadow IT. So in the sense that So one team might be very comfortable with AWS. They might decide to just go with AWS service provider. One team may be much more comfortable with Azure. So recently, in fact, a very interesting story. I was talking to this media house that we work with based out of Europe. They're very large. They're across the globe, headquartered in Europe. Now, when I was talking to the team, we were given to understand that they're mostly an Azure shop. But then when we finished the call, we realized that they're 75% in AWS shop and they're 25% in Azure shop. Because the people on the call itself were surprising their own security team, saying, hey, we're mostly AWS. So the security team was like, oh, okay, this is kind of new for us. So yeah, let's just regroup and figure out what we are in the first place before we even go ahead. So yes, this is a thing. So there's definitely multi-cloud. But I see that mostly with larger companies. And I also see the trend of larger companies trying to centralize on one provider. So they would try and centralize, but there are instances where there is a lot of multi-cloud as well, yes.
Right. Okay. And to your point about, I guess that adds another challenge for security when they have to find out on the phone call that, there is this whole environment that they had no idea about.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's challenging because they were really caught unawares, and which is one thing that I keep talking about in our trainings, especially Devsecops, is you have to look at security as a part of the product engineering process rather than a siloed separate team. Because if you do that, if you look at it as a siloed separate team, there's really no way you can get any kind of gains in whatever you're trying to do with these product engineering teams. So that is something you have to we have to work towards that as security people.
Right. And it's just an interesting segue into what does DevSecOps mean for people who probably are listening to this? I doubt people are listening to the term for the first time, but what's your definition of DevSecOps?
So my definition of DevSecOps is really all about application delivery, right? So today we are in a position where the business wants applications to be delivered faster. And we have solved a lot of bottlenecks along the way in terms of application delivery. So we have gone to a more simple source management system through Git. We are using continuous integration with stuff like Jenkins, whatever you use for continuous integration. We have gone to the cloud where deployments are more automated, more faster. We have gone to frameworks that are simpler to deploy code, release code faster. The only thing that is blocking us in many ways is security, right? And DevOps is essentially came about where dev or as code has started consuming everything else. So you're writing infrastructure stuff as code now. You're writing, pretty much policies as code. You're writing test automation as code. So pretty much every dev has started to eat up all of these things. The only thing or a few things that still remain is security. So DevSecOps is really leaning into that and saying, look, let us do security as part of the continuous development lifecycle or the SDL itself, and do it continuously rather than doing it at a point in time where we could miss out and have a lot of security issues.
Right. And talking about DevSecOps, what does, I guess from your perspective, because dev is eating up into security, what does it look like from a maturity perspective? Like what's a good maturity in your perspective in that space?
You see, one thing that I always suggest everyone look at is, first of all, understand the culture of that engineering team that is taking up. So one thing that I've seen DevSecOps projects work rather than not work is when they're a little more decentralized rather than centralized. Now, this idea of an extremely central DevSecOps implementation is possible, but it's tougher to do, in my opinion. So, because different engineering, so let's say your company is making 10 products or 10 apps, let's put it that way, and each app is being produced by a different team. Now, that team is going to have their own cadence, they're going to have their own processes of development, delivery, deployment, and so on. So, the maturity or the application of DevSecOps is different for different teams. So you might have to do different things in different teams. You might have to use different tools for different teams. So I would say the maturity really starts from the processes that you are able to integrate into this team. So for instance, let's say you're able to do threat modeling as part of the sprint. That's a measure of success for me. Let's say you're able to eliminate bugs right at the developer's IDE. That's another measure of success. Let's say you're able to eliminate bugs before, like 3 processes before the build or deployment of any sorts. That's a measure of success. So the earlier you're able to catch most of your bugs and start to identify them and fix them in the release with
Yep.
a good amount of support from your product engineering team, and not making them hate you. That itself is a huge modicum of maturity as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, that's an interesting one, because I think to your point, like if because I'm pretty sure a lot of people listening to this have probably never had an AppSec person in the company, and they want to start into that product security space and want to know, where do we start? What would your advice be on that? Like, and this is assuming they a lot of companies have security awareness training. They're like, oh, okay, I've got security awareness training, but it's like not really code review or secure code training, but it's like security awareness, like two different things. But I mean, that's a whole different conversation. For people who are starting today and realize that they have that gap in security for AppSec, what do you recommend as like low-hanging fruits that they can tick off today, especially if they don't have an AppSec person?
So if they don't have an AppSec person, I think whether you do or don't have an AppSec person, there are certain things that you have to do regardless, right? So an AppSec person is essentially, in my opinion, somebody who can just guide that process along. The AppSec person should not have to bear the entire load of AppSec. That's where I come from. So for me, it would largely be that the engineering team themselves have a good amount of working knowledge of security flaws. That is the first thing that I would think of. Working knowledge of security flaws and their defenses, of course. Just knowledge of flaws is pointless. That's something that would be very important as far as I'm concerned, especially for the stack that they're on. That extends to if you have a separate ops team or if you have people who are doing DevOps, that would extend to them as well. Because working knowledge of security for all these teams, working knowledge of technical security for that product would be very important. And second thing is doing things as early as possible. So if they have a working knowledge of security, they should look at optimizing their processes just like they've optimized for, let's say, end-to-end testing or unit testing. So just like they've optimized for every other aspect of their workflow, they should optimize security for that workflow. So that's really where I would start. And the good thing is you can do a lot of this for free today, in the sense that you don't need to start off with buying a crap ton of tools, right? So you don't need to. You don't need to. In fact, you can do this entirely on a $0 budget. You don't need it.
So like, just if you were to go a layer deeper, to your point about teaching the devs about the I guess threat and how to defend against it, what's a free tool in that space, I guess?
So, I mean, I would say just start off with something like the OWASP cheat sheets to get started. Look at the OWASP Web Security Testing Guide. Look at the tools from OWASP itself, right? The Open Web Application Security Project, they have a ton of research out there. You can get started with that. Yes, obviously there are going to be limitations in terms of understanding, but today you're seeing that a lot of people are releasing a lot of amazing content. So you should be able to get started with this and then start to, maybe, and of course you can look at stuff from conferences and stuff. There's a lot of YouTube videos of conference recordings of multiple events.
So that would help them, I guess, build an understanding of how to look at security. Would threat modeling be something that would help as well? I guess any person should be able to. It doesn't have to your point about AppSec person doesn't need to take the whole workload, but any security person in the company or even a developer, I guess, should be able to learn up about the basics of threat modeling and apply that to their product. Is that right?
Yes, ideally, that's one of the things I teach. We teach a course called Agile Threat Modeling. And in that course, we essentially talk about the fact that, look, threat modeling gives you a massive benefit when it comes to finding your flaws even before they become flaws, right? So that's where you should be, or that's where you should try to be as much as you can. So let's say I have this feature I'm building today. So let's say this feature is for an online examination portal where I, as a student, am able to take an exam. So very simply, if you think about it, one of the possibilities of abuse of this feature is that I, as a student, can also grade my exam, right? Which is something you should not allow, which directly points to authorization, which directly points to, hey, you need to have permissions built into each and every action related to the examination stream, and you should check for those permissions. So you see that the threat model starts as a basic abuse case, but you can make its thread way down to saying, hey, your pen testing team, please test for authorization cases in this release because we have this feature being released. Make sure you try and do direct object reference attacks, authorization attacks to try and bypass this. So you see that you're actually adding context to your security program by doing threat modeling a lot more. And threat modeling is not rocket science. It's basically just taking your application by its features or by its systemic view and then breaking that down into threats. That's really it.
Sweet. And yeah, it's a great explanation as well, because I think I wouldn't consider myself as an AppSec person, but I've run threat modeling for platforms as well as products as well. And I think it was the most fun part was to not be the security person in the exercise and let others be the security people in the exercise and let them figure out ways, and because they probably know the product better than you do anyways.
By a long shot.
Yeah, 100%.
See, for instance, we were doing threat modeling for a large insurance company. So when we do pen test, we do a lot of threat modeling before the pen test. So once we were doing a threat model and we were talking about, okay, you can do this injection. This was way before, when I was way stupider, we didn't know much about threat modeling that time. So we were doing what we called a threat model. So we had not involved business folks. We're not involved the business analysts or business folks. So the CFO wanted to sit in on the threat modeling meeting, which was interesting. And I was like, why does the CFO want to sit in? And then when we actually got threat modeling and we discussed all these different injections, possibilities, the CFO said, you know what, guys, this is all great, but you may have forgotten one thing. One of the things that we consider extremely critical for this application is the formula that we use to calculate some actuarial information about this insurance policy or these insurance policies. If that formula gets leaked, then we have a huge problem. Have you accounted that in your threat model? And we realized that we hadn't at all. And that was a huge eye-opening experience personally for me, because I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, maybe we should get business folks involved because they know the business risk, and ultimately business risk is security risk. So,
yeah, you're right. That's because otherwise, we can assume technical risk, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't map to a business risk, then it's probably a low category. You should ignore it anyways, right?
Yeah.
I think to your point about, I guess, doing this at scale. Now we spoke about people who are in the beginning of that AppSec curve. What about doing AppSec at scale? And I think you kind of mentioned being on the cutting edge earlier. We kind of touched upon a bit serverless as well. My assumption, I think of, I guess, serverless being that other edge, or I guess cutting edge for lack of a better word, where code has become, you don't even have to worry about infrastructure. It's the code which is driving everything. And AppSec is kind of that's my assumption of AppSec at scale. What does AppSec at scale mean for you in cloud?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. So AppSec at scale for me is, first of all, again, is a little bit of a maturity cycle. It's a little bit of an evolution. It's not really one big thing. So for me, it would be first, of course, starting to do the hygiene things well, right? Especially let's say you're doing static code analysis, let's say you're doing source composition, let's say you're doing some amount of scanning. Doing that hygiene stuff well as part of your SDL, whatever security activities you embed across the SDL is the first stage of scaling it. The second stage of scaling it, I would say, is look at constantly repeating patterns, right? Look at if you can eliminate whole classes of flaws. For instance, let's say you're constantly seeing this pattern of injection. Right? Injection is a very overused flaw, but I'm going to use it nevertheless because people understand it also very well.
Like a SQL injection.
So let's take SQL injection. Right now, let's say you're constantly seeing a pattern of SQL injection. So that points to 2-3 things. One, of course, developer awareness. Two, it also points to the fact that, hey, let's say we start using an ORM library, all of this is gone. All of these patterns are just gone. This entire massive, what used to be a huge injection problem is just gone.
Yeah.
Now, let's say you have cross-site scripting as an issue. Let's say you can eliminate whole classes of cross-site scripting flaws by doing a good job of either output escaping, CSP, or using frameworks that do auto escaping. That is, again, a huge classes of flaw eliminated. So you should look at doing that over time and start to build that out as a baseline. And of course, so the idea is that over time, you should only incrementally look at very specific classes of flaws. So over time, you should eliminate the possibility that SQL injection is even there, cross-site scripting is even there, session flaws are even there. You should get to, hey, can this business logic feature be abused? That is where you should be getting to. So that's really solving it at scale for me.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's not more in terms of like you have so many tools, but it's more like how big a risk you're solving, how quickly you're solving that. Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, it's the speed, it's the risk, and of course, it is the elimination of said risk in a meaningful way, right? So that's really, yeah.
And
Or
what,
I mean, if not elimination, at least bringing down the risk.
right. And how does this transfer to, say, people who are, I guess, companies? I'm thinking of an example like A Cloud Guru, that website that I think they claim that they're completely on serverless. Everything that they do is in serverless. I'm sure there are other organizations as well. At that,
We are serverless.
oh, there you go.
100%
So,
serverless.
and this is even better. So, if you guys are serverless as well, what does security look like for you then? Like, where do you guys focus on from the security perspective? Because serverless obviously means you guys are on cloud as well. Then, how does security change in a serverless world?
That's an interesting question because serverless has kind of taken the world by storm. If you're looking at some of the, in fact, I've seen serverless because start off as this niche thing that, hey, you know what, only some hobbyists are doing, to now becoming, hey, you know what, it's running Lowe's hardware store in the US, which is a huge hardware stuff. So, or, different companies. So for me, actually, serverless has been a big security plus, and I'll tell you why. One, the idea of serverless itself is that you don't need to manage any infrastructure per se. Right? You're not running it on a server. I mean, of course, your cloud provider is running it in a server, but that's not your problem. You're not really responsible for managing server infrastructure. Right? That itself is a pretty big win as far as I'm concerned. Because look, let's say you're in a small team, you're always going to be strapped for resources. You're not going to be able to recruit massive sysadmins or DevOps folks to be able to sit and do all of this re-engineering work. So for me, the adoption of serverless was initially that I don't have to sit and worry about it. Second, in serverless, you are able to get very granular with your control definition. So let's say you have a function that does add user. Okay, let's take a function called add user. So everything is broken down into functions as a service. So you have functions. One function just takes input from a user and adds that user information to that database. Very simple function. Now, what you can do and what serverless gives you the opportunity to do from a security perspective is threat model at a granular level. So you can only threat model that one function rather than threat modeling a system. That becomes the first benefit. Second, you can restrict privileges based on that one function. So add user, the function needs to just be able to create records in the database. You don't need to give it delete privileges. You don't need to give it even access privileges of any sort. You just need to give it put item privileges and that's it, you're done. So the ability to go very granular from a security perspective is very high in serverless, although people don't do it that way. A lot of people are just, they just give you willy-nilly all permissions and they just go ahead. But I'm saying that when you understand serverless, there are some specific benefits that it has. But there are some downsides as well. One downside is if you are not disciplined in your product delivery in a server environment or a typical server-like environment, serverless is not going to help you. Let me put it this way. Let us say you're not doing, let me put it in a slightly more easy to understand way. Let's say you're not doing logging and monitoring. Let's say you're not doing a good job of logging, especially security logging in a server-like environment. Serverless is going to kill you because there is no real, you can't just SSH into a box and check out what's happening in serverless. You need to rely on logs. You need to rely on your events working, right? And that needs to produce some kind of telemetry. So if you're not disciplined before, this is only going to amplify your lack of discipline. So that's one thing I've seen with serverless. I've learned it the hard way because I've built serverless apps, so I know that it's a pain doing this. Traceability, observability in serverless is a huge challenge. And of course, there are companies that are solving this challenge. There are technologies that help you solve this challenge. But if you're not disciplined, then you're not going to be disciplined. That's one thing. The second thing with serverless is that an attack, especially certain classes of attacks like FinOps attacks and serverless, can literally bankrupt you. It's very straightforward. So for instance, there's a whole class of regular expression denial of service attacks. Now, when you're running denial of service on a server, yes, it's one thing, it just brings down the server. It's okay, fine, you can bring it up. But in serverless, every time you have a denial of service attack, you are spending compute, right? You're spending money. So let's say I can scale a denial of service attack on a serverless function or a serverless app. You're spending money to run that denial of service attack. So there was, in fact, I demonstrated this in AppSec day last year when I was talking about serverless and GraphQL. There was one request that I ran, which takes about, which the entire app would be about $5 a month if you ran it normally. But let's say there's this denial of service vulnerability in one of those apps, I mean, regular expression denial of service vulnerability. The same app would cost you $100,000 to run. So same thing. So yeah,
Wow.
that was an interesting, that was an
Yeah,
interesting
wow.
case.
That's insane, man. The same, a $5 app just spiking up to 100. And I think this kind of goes into how finance also has to work closely with you if you're in the cloud space, because these tech spikes, the cost spike that you get, you can't wait for the end of the month to figure out that, oh, suddenly my bill is high. I wonder why, what happened like 3 weeks ago. It's too late by then already. Like, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned it. I think, so it's really interesting to hear about the change of security from a serverless perspective. Do you find that, I guess, because there is no server, for lack of a better word, does that mean, it forces everyone to be security? And I guess app security has kind of become even more important. Is there like software composition and SCST and are these things still relevant in serverless space and static code analysis?
No, it's still the same app in the sense that it's not this one big monolithic app. You're just dealing with a bunch of functions that would otherwise make up a monolithic app. So yes, you still find that static analysis or whatever other analysis is still going to be equally important. Source composition analysis is going to be equally important. With serverless, source composition becomes a little bit more important because with serverless, you also have the possibility of layers and stuff like that. So in fact, in serverless, let's say you want to use a particular library all the time, you can install it as a layer. And that layer kind of runs as a
bus,
as an add-on kind of a thing to that serverless stack. And if the layer is vulnerable, you can see that the attacker can leverage that layer as well. So it's still the same thing. So AppSec still applies. Good things about AppSec still apply. Bad things also still apply. The same attacks apply, except that there are certain cases in which the effect or the impact of that attack is either more amplified or less amplified, depending on the case.
Right. Okay. And I think too, is there a thing, and I read this somewhere, I'm keen to know your opinion, is there a thing called too many functions?
Too many functions?
As in when you have, because you can have too many microservices. Everything is a microservice, and you have this microservice overload. Is that a same challenge with serverless as well?
Not really. At least I have not come across it. But yes, I mean, it is. I can see that becoming a bit of a problem for some folks or for some kind of use cases. See, with serverless, you have to understand that, again, it's broken down into functions. So the way you build out these functions become very important. I don't think it's a question of too many functions. In fact, I would say that it's a much easier to manage large function applications with serverless rather than with something like a microservice. Because microservices, you're dealing with queues and you're dealing with a lot of data being exchanged over multiple channels, which becomes a little bit of a challenge. But with serverless, especially if you're doing it on a mature cloud provider like an AWS or an Azure, you're dealing with a good amount of services that can help you manage this problem rather than a standard microservices like the cloud.
Oh, right. And I think to your point, another layer to that is also the fact that cloud services would always keep updating the language versions as well. They would stop supporting the older language versions, which forces you to update your code as well, which is another security problem solved, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that all of these people are very concerned about, and I think they're doing a good job of, is that they treat secure, especially the cloud providers. Again, I think all cloud providers, at least the three big ones, are treating security as a first-class citizen. They're not, they're not treating security as, okay, this is a nice to have, but maybe we should have it. Yeah. They realize that security is a major hindrance in the way they sell and market their solution. So if they make it easier to market and sell their solution, then security has to be great. So I think they realize that, and they're doing it. So for instance, last year Capital One happened. AWS pretty much very quickly was able to respond with that EC2 IMDS v2 solution where the metadata is not directly exposed today. So
That's right.
there is, I think these folks are taking stock of that, and that's a very real problem, and they're dealing with it.
Sounds good. And I think it's a good way to just move into our next section, which is also called Mythbusters. Is there any, what's the most common cloud security, or maybe in this context, let's just go app security. What's the most common app security myth or misconception you've heard in cloud?
Yeah, so in the cloud, I think the first misconception is that, hey, once you host on the cloud, it's secure. Not really.
Yep.
And once you host on the cloud, it's their problem. No, again, not really. Not by a long shot again. So yeah.
Oh, is there a misconception specific to app security in the cloud though?
Again, app security in the cloud, I would take the same set of misconceptions in the sense that, hey, once you load your app on the cloud, you're more secure. That's not true, because your app is still your app. And if you built it crappily and you've written all kinds of insecure code, then it's going to come and bite you. So it's, I would say it's an extension of the same misconception.
Perfect answer. And what are not people talking enough about in, say, the cloud security or app security space that you feel people should talk more about?
Defense.
That
would be, yeah. So let's put it this way, right? Now, there is red team penetration testing, which has its place. Of course, that has always been the glamorous side of the security profession. Then, of course, there is on the other side, which is incident response. There is your, post-event investigation, etc., which is also has a great place. Very important. I'm not denying that. But I'm saying that there's this huge section in the middle, which is essentially a lot of boring defense, or at least what is otherwise considered boring. But things that need to be done as a regular process that seem to be not spoken of so much, or not given that much attention. This is something we're supposed to do anyway, is one perspective of that. But that's not really so, because a lot of us don't do it, right? That's what we've seen. So there needs to be a lot more focus given to proactive defense, proactive threat modeling. Of course, that also forms a part of proactive defense. And I think that's very important to talk about. That's not nearly as discussed as, let's say, a latest exploit or something that is, that is gaining a lot of traction in terms of exploitation, or somebody compromise this, compromise that.
Yeah, I think I'm glad at least you and I spoke about this when you mentioned AWS responded quite well to the Capital One issue earlier. So I'm glad we covered that part, that how defense can be really good as well sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've got another section that I've added recently. It's all about COVID-19 and how it's affecting people.
Okay.
I'm assuming you guys are in lockdown as well, similar to the rest of the world, and working from home. How has this changed your approach to security in a completely remote environment?
So we were always a very remote friendly organization, in the sense that all people work from home all the time.
Yep.
And I myself am traveling a lot, so I'm working generally from wherever, home, hotel, airport, pretty much all the time. I think certain decisions that we've made early on, this was in 2011, 2012, when we were a very young company, has started to see a lot of value. So we started building a lot of our apps at then. So a lot of our stuff is centrally hosted, it's on the cloud. We don't ever rely on hosting our own stuff in our own laptops, or even carrying data in our own laptops. So that's one thing. So the second thing that we see a lot of is, of course, when people work, we again work with a lot of standardized technologies that are again cloud hosted. So we leverage a lot of hosted services, again, and well-known hosted services. So like AWS, Google, whatever. So we leverage a lot of these services to ensure that we don't really have an availability issue at any given point in time. Also, it solves other security challenges for us. So, but we were always remote. So this luckily has not seen us suddenly change our entire way of working. So I'm sure some organizations have had to literally abandon all past forms of control or security control to be able to generate, VPNs and stuff like that for people to log in. We have always been a little more like, hey, you know what? We need this to work from anywhere because all of us are traveling. All of us, we want the freedom to be able to work from anywhere. So that has kind of been our go-to thing. We are actually doing a lot more work now in zero trust, both from a client perspective as well as our own perspective. So we are one of those eat your own dog food companies. So we kind of try and build stuff ourselves that we use ourselves that we can always market outside as well.
Oh, sweet. No, that's pretty good. I think it sounds like zero trust should be another topic.